Hi, my name is Mark Clark. I'm with the University of Florida and also an affiliate faculty with the Florida Sea Grant Program.
Hi, I'm Alex Hernandez. I'm with the University of Florida and funded by Florida Sea Grant.
What we're going to do is show you how to make a reef panel. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is go over the list of materials you're going to need. First off, you have to have the CSA mix, one roll or swatch of jute that is 96 inches long, 4 feet wide or 48 inches wide, and then soaked to saturation. So basically immerse it in water for about 10 minutes and then it drain for about 10 minutes. And that way it's saturated, but basically is not really dripping water anymore. You're also going to need a mixing tub. You're going to need a mixing device to actually mix the CSA material. There's 2 squeegees that you'll see where we use these, both for scraping and kind of recovering some CSA material. We found that a actual cake frosting knife works pretty well to help scrape material out of the bucket. But then also make sure you've got your safety gear, safety glasses, and having gloves. The other thing you're going to need is over here, we have the mold that the reef panel will be cast on. We talked about this a little bit earlier. There's also a piece of plastic that will lay over the top to keep everything moist when we're done forming the panel. And then the last thing, which is a little bit different than anything we've done before, is to have 2 pieces of wood, relatively narrow. These are about 1/8 of an inch wide. And you'll see later that this helps us actually push the CSA, jute CSA material in between these groups. So you'll see how all that comes together. All right, so that's what you need. And we'll go ahead and make our mix. The first thing we add is the sand into the bucket. And we're going to add our CSA, and you got to be careful with this when you want to shake it a little bit first so that it doesn't spring up. Sometimes it'll come out of the bucket in a big thump and it'll kind of kick a lot of that powder right up close to you. And the next thing we have is our water. And we've actually added ice to this water to make sure it's nice and cold. It's a pretty warm day. We're in the mid-90s right now. And so we want to keep the mix as cool as we can. That buys us time, slows the reaction down. And so we're going to do a preliminary mixing of the CSA and sand before we add the flow control. So we agitate everything initially, working our way into the sand. This is where we use our spatula to scrape sides of the bucket. Mix once again, and you'll notice that the CSA is very thick right now. And all we're going to do is add 1 packet of this flow control, and you're going to see how this liquefies. It's actually adding a powder, but the result is actually going to be an increased fluidity. And this is what's allowed us to have a small amount of water added, but still be able to coat the jute with the CSA. One last quick scraping of the sides. Make sure we've got everything in solution. And we're ready to start mixing this with the jute. All right, so now that we have our mix of CSA, we're going to get ready to knead that into our jute. And here's where our first smaller spatula comes in. We can use it to scrape the inside of the bucket. Make sure we got all of our material in the tub. Don't worry if there's a little bit that was still attached to the sides. It'll work its way in. So just a process of kind of kneading, and not trying to squeeze the material, but basically dragging the jute through the CSA, coating all the surfaces. I tend to roll up the jute. Now I have lots of different ways to actually do this, but it seems like rolling the jute, and you'll see me unroll it and then re-roll it several times here. Seems to work quite well to provide an even, uniform coverage. But the key, especially when it's warm like this, is to move along quickly. The set time is probably well within 10 minutes or so at this temperature. And that's one of the reasons we use the ice, is to bring that temperature down. So even though the ambient temperature is about 95, our working temperature in here is probably still in the 70s or so. So one thing you always want to be cognizant of is this situation here where you don't have really adequate coating. And so you're always looking for these reddish colors, and that's usually a sign that either the sand was probably a little too dry, or the jute was a little thicker. The lack of uniformity in the jute can be a rather challenging issue. But either way, at this point, now that we've got it mixed up, we're going to lay it out on the table. And the first thing we need to do is to make sure that we know where the hinge is. So this jute's been folded in half. When it was laid out, it was cut, it was folded in half and half again. So here's the actual two edges. This is the hinge. So we want to push it so that the hinge runs right down the center of the table, so that when we finally open it up, it will be in approximately the right spot. Because this doesn't slide very well on the plastic. It tends to grab hold and move it. So similar to what we do with the prism, we lay this out first, trying to maximize the width and the length. But unlike the prisms, we have to go and take a step right now where even after we've roughly laid it out, we're going to close it up again and then squeegee the surface. And what this does is minimizes the likelihood of having closed cells. When we finish with the jute, we want to have these open cells. That lets water in, that lets critters go back and forth. And so to do that, we need to remove all of this loose material. So we fold it all back up again into one corner. We take a larger squeegee, go across the table, and remove as much of the CSA that's just sitting on the surface that came off the jute. We're going to use this a little bit later. But by removing this now, it won't become a sealed surface in the final panel. All right, so now what we're going to do is just go ahead and lay that jute right back out again. Open it up. And again, this is your best time to kind of make sure it's going to be stretched right to both sides and to a length, the maximum length. So you pull on one end until you see it start to pull off the other end. Okay, now at this point, if we were making a prism, we would place the prism form and roll it up. This is where it differs significantly than making a prism. We've laid this out on a piece of plastic, basically the same length as the table. We're going to pull this down to one end. Now we're going to take our form and place it up on the table. Maybe about halfway across. And now what we're going to do is take that jute layer and pull it right back on. Here you have to be a little bit careful if you're working with your partner to pull at the same time. Otherwise, if somebody's pulling faster than the other, it'll flop right off the table. But we're going to pull it right up and over the top of the form. And we're going to pull it so that we're about halfway. We have about half of the overhang on one side equal to half on the other side. Pull a little bit more. Okay. Now what we have to do is get the jute to push down into each of the valleys. So this is where our boards are going to come in. And so working with your partner on two sides, the first thing you're going to do is just push straight down, and you see it draws in from both sides. So now we've got it bottomed out in the bottom of the form. And now what you have to do is with one hand hold this form, and with the other hand push down this form, but don't push in the middle, push on the uphill side. So we're basically going to push from here, and it's going to try to drag, and eventually it'll bottom out. So now go up again, push again. So you're kind of working it down in there, making sure you're actually bottomed out. Okay. Now when you're bottomed out, you're going to pick this form up, move this one. Now I'm holding that, and now you're going to do the same thing here. Takes a little bit of practice to try to kind of work it into that space, but you just walk your way down to one end. Then you push it in on this side. Okay, and now you're going to switch directions, holding with this hand and pushing down on this side. And it's a little bit hard because you're starting to drag, you're having to drag the rest of that material. So you just have to keep working it, but you definitely want to get all the way to the bottom. Make sure you're bottoming out. Okay, and now we can put this aside. Right there. That's good. Now what you want to do is you want to make sure you're to length. So our form goes out to 4 feet, and so we want to make sure our jute is all the way out to the extent of that 4 feet. Now this is something probably we could have done before we pushed it down into the grooves, but regardless, you want to always be trying to maximize your surface area. And remember not just to pull the top piece, but the bottom as well. Okay, and then once you've got that far, then you take whatever's residual hanging on the side and you just tuck it up, flip it up so that it's up on the actual form, not just kind of hanging willy-nilly over the side. So make sure it's up on top, that little ledge on one side, and then you're going to do the same with the other side. I'm just going to flatten that out. Now, the last thing we do, and what we're learning, is that the likelihood of this moving is really dependent on how it's oriented in the waves. What we want to do is have the orientation of the panel. If the wave was coming this way, this is basically the orientation we want. We don't want the wave coming in this direction. It tends to pick up the panel and walk it. But we still want to add a couple of spots where we can stake this down to the substrate. And so what we want to do is just create a couple of little openings at several spots in the middle, on the outer edge here, and then also on this end. Maybe something that could receive about an 1 by 1.5 inch piece of wood. On the outer 2/3, right down the middle. and then on both sides. Okay, after that, all you have to do is take this, we're going to take the residual material. So if we have anything left in our CSA mix, we're going to add this to our edges and reinforce those a little bit. Put that on both sides here. And if you still have some left, you can run it across the outer edge, because the edges, of course, are the most exposed, the likely to be, damaged either during transport or from other things bumping into it. So you can reinforce those pieces. Basically, move that in a little bit. Don't want to take too much time on it. And then when you're done, you just take that residual plastic off the end, curl it up. Do the same thing on this end. So it makes for a nice little shelf there. And then the last thing you want to do is add a piece of plastic as a sheet over the top. And that helps capture and trap whatever moisture might evaporate, because we want that moisture to help cure the CSA, because it happens pretty quickly. And if it's a warm day like today, we very likely, after maybe 15 minutes when this starts to dry out, I'll come in and just spritz this a little bit with a hose. It won't wash the cement off, by then it'll already have set. But what it does is it adds a little bit more moisture, because today there's probably a lot of evaporative losses going on. So then this will sit for probably, if you let it sit for at least an hour or 2 hours, you'd be able to pop it off the mold. At that point, it is pretty fragile in the sense that it's rigid in line with, like it's rigid in this direction, but in this direction still very flexible. So if I was to take this out, I would tip it up, and so that the ridges are running up and down, and then keep it in that orientation for at least 24 hours until it sets. But that's the basic protocol for building a reef panel.